Well, going back to the human
Hmm.
side, your intro here, I'm uh, I'm very good at preaching to the people who are designing and managing competitions that when it comes to public open space, the
Okay.
public realm, I said I always tell them I'm not participating because I believe in the public process. In
Okay.
your language, you actually tell us we're designing for the public, the stakeholders, and this. Yet you're not allowing us to have any dialogue whatsoever, or for them to have any
Oh,
input. And you're asking for a design competition idea that is, as we're designers, we bake these ideas into form, right?
hmm.
In the absence of any public process. So
That's
to
such
me,
yeah.
it's an insult. It's an insult to the public process if you have people out there falling in love with their shapes and forms
Right,
and
right.
without that are not informed by a conversation with the public and more kind of an egocentric idea of what something should be.
It's a very
And
antiquated way of thinking of
yeah,
design
it
that
really is.
we as designers and architects and landscape architects and um any urban planners of it's the argument is no longer like it's not even an argument anymore. We all just
Yeah,
understand that like, hey, the people need to be
hopefully.
involved,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Well, yeah,
hopefully.
I would say, maybe I'm optimistic, but I would say the majority of designers that I interact with really understand
Yeah,
and
yeah,
subscribe and
yeah,
also apply those ideas.
yeah,
I think if you don't, you're getting filtered out.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because our work at Hunters Point South, that I guess you're familiar with,
Yes.
uh, has attracted a lot of international attention, including the city of Rotterdam, that took real interest in it because of it was kind of checking all the boxes,
Yeah.
and they have a huge immigrant community in
Hmm.
Rotterdam. A lot of them have sort of clustered around or replaced the kind of dock worker housing that found its way clustering around the various ports,
Right.
the harbor rather. They've got multiple harbors because their harbors are cut in off the river that comes in from the sea. Anyway, they have this big immigrant population, but no parks because they
Mm.
found their way in more of a kind of an industrial or a post-industrial location of the city, which in the case of Rotterdam is very, very much in the city. And so, they together with a lot of European cities have this wonderful reputation of having the great competitions. But the park that comes out of that didn't come out of that public discourse, that didn't take its form
Sure.
from that public discourse or its design program from that discourse, they're not embraced. They're not well embraced, especially by that immigrant community. Some I think more sophisticated Europeans appreciate them for their art,
Right.
you know, but in terms of how are they touching my daily life, no.
Yeah. Right.
And
Right.
so
Right.
Rotterdam said, we're going to have a competition for a new park here, and we'd like you to come and compete, but we're not going to ask you to draw forms. We're just going to ask you to present your attitude,
I
your
love that.
approach,
Yeah.
and we won it. And we've gone and since had all that public discourse, and it's now funded and in construction already, and known as Nelson Mandela Park,
Correct. Yeah.
like 8 or 10 acres of land reclamation. They're actually filling in the inner part of a massive harbor to create
Right.
a park where the people are.
Right.
Instead of saying, oh, let's see, the last piece of idle land we have is about 30 miles away,
Hmm.
and expecting this immigrant, double income kind of a family to find
Sure.
with 3 kids to find its way to something 30 miles away.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What are the chances it's going to touch their daily lives?
Hmm.
And this whole idea of the land reclamation in the inner part of these harbors is really creating parks in the middle of the city, an 8 acre park.
Wow.
And it was so successful that in the next harbor over, they selected Van Valkenburg to do that one.
Oh,
So,
great.
so we're both working on these parks for Rotterdam that are coming out of maybe for a change, that are really coming out of a meaningful public dialogue.
Yeah.
Uh, so, as you were saying, the sands are shifting a little bit
Right,
in
right.
the right direction, I hope.
MVVA does such wonderful gardens. I've
Well,
always,
that's that, but how about public spaces, people spaces?
well, I'm sure that they do great
Yeah,
people
yeah.
spaces, but I just remember I went to Ohio State and they did a garden for Knowlton Hall for
Oh, yeah,
the
sure. Your
architecture. Yeah.
architecture design.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And I just was such a great precedent for me to at the time I was smoking cigarettes, as the deep thinking designer, right? And just sitting on those big monolithic
yeah,
laid down marble stones and getting to experience all different seasons in that
yeah. And they were very
environment.
resilient plants that could resist the cigarette.
Okay, so I was at ASLA in 2022 and I was doing a podcast and I was talking with this woman, Patricia Fabregas. Anyway, she brought up the concept of Sonder, and the definition of Sonder is the profound feeling of realizing that everyone, including strangers passing in the street, has a life as complex as one's own, which they are constantly living despite one's personal lack of awareness of it. Okay.
Yeah,
All right. And so personally, I cannot seem to escape thinking about Sonder and its relationship to landscape architecture. And so I wanted to ask you, given your interest in the sociological works by William White and the new interpretation of that work by SWAXL entitled Plaza Life Revisited, Thomas, where does the concept of Sonder come into play in public spaces?
I did a little research before the podcast,
Okay.
and I was kind of stumped by this concept.
Mm-hmm.
And I need you to help me just move it along one more step
Sure. Yeah, I
for
could do that.
relevance to what we're doing.
So, for me, and maybe we're just kind of riffing here at this point, as
Yeah, yeah,
opposed to just coming up with like an answer. But for me, the reason why I thought it was fascinating and I thought that you would be a good person to ask this question is for me, it kind of asks, like, the idea almost begs the question as designers, are we, when we're designing public spaces, are we the ones that are aware of this Sonder, that everybody is going through their own life, their own existential movement, whether it's existential crisis or existential, I don't know what the opposite of existential
yeah,
crisis would be, or realization, or we're all going through something, right? And there's a moment where we stop and realize everybody's going through something. Yet we as humans still choose to conjugate and almost go through all of these experiences together in a similar space, but individually, internally. And so I'm like, as a designer of public spaces, do we inherently understand that? Do we facilitate it? Do we yeah, what
yeah,
is our role, if any, right? Maybe I'm
yeah.
reaching. I don't know.
Well, I can't speak for others, but I can speak for myself. And you're really tapping into the core of my work, which
Okay.
is this: uh, who are these people that are going to be here? And my job is to walk in their shoes as much as I can. Uh, that's why you'll get a client that'll say, "Oh, we really need a space that does this, this, and this," sort of what we call the 10-pound program, but they've given us a 5-pound bag. They want a
Yeah.
lot,
Hmm.
but we're always searching for a hierarchy of spaces that are there for people to find as their own, sometimes one that's out in the middle of it as that common ground, that mixing bowl, whatever you may want it, the shared
Mhm.
ground, whatever you may want to call it, because there is that sense they've in that time they've plugged into that common thread that they have with their neighbors to their right and to their left.
Mhm.
And then there's other times when people may want to reflect on that or even on their own internal uh, feelings. And so the provision for those personal spaces is just as important as the big celebratory kind of the great lawn or whatever it
Mhm.
might be. And it's our my work is maybe without understanding Sounder.
Mhm.
uh, by the way, that was a famous movie called Sounder.
Okay.
A famous movie called Sounder was one of the early black films in the 1960s.
Okay.
So, but it had a U in it.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's what I got when I typed it out first.
Sure. Mhm.
But anyway, back to this. This is this whole idea that we as designers have to be in touch with it. I don't think we have to be specifically in touch. Obviously, we can't be,
Mhm.
but we have to be humanists and a little bit of sociologists and a little bit of psychologists. We have to have those forces at work to remind us of the people centric aspect of what we're doing and how diverse it has to be.
Mm.
Uh, it's not a place where we walk in and we drop our personal egos on a piece of terrain.
Right.
That is, we have so many histories of that just being the wrong approach. We were hired to in in Denver. They other than their civic park where all their civic buildings kind of surround it, but it's not really well used in downtown. Their only park in downtown is a park called Skyline Park. You
Okay.
may or may not have heard of it. It was designed by Halpern,
Okay.
and it after about 10 years, it had just fallen out of favor. It never did reach any favor because there was no process
Right.
that led to its design,
Mhm.
public process. It was a kind of a very personalized expression from Halpern that created the park and the form. Uh, but it just became a barren, kind of a unused space in the middle of downtown, growing downtown
Mhm.
Cleveland, excuse me,
Denver.
Denver. And the preservationists wanted to preserve it just as it was
Sure. I understand that.
because
Yeah.
because Halpern did it.
Right.
But it wasn't working at all as a public space. It wasn't serving the downtown. And if it was, for example, in Portland, I could understand putting some of his projects under glass because there's such a rich
Right.
public system for that city
Yeah.
that they could afford to have some quote unquote under glass. But this was the only space the city had. Uh, and as I was doing my research, we encountered this. He never had it in his monograph. He
Mhm.
never had photographs taken of it, and we found in our research that he was equating it to, or he was inspired by his experience in the California mountains as a child. In the California mountains, not Denver's Rockies, but in the California mountains.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
uh, but that whole experience was then brought in as a gift and laid into downtown Denver for 3 blocks, which is equivalent to 6 New York City blocks long.
Mhm.
And it was a series of mounds and indentations. He removed the sidewalk entirely from the street as if he didn't want to even know there was a city or a street there. And it was just this kind of quote unquote experience. But it blocked all the views to the retail behind it.
Mhm.
It had limited access for people. It was not designed for people. It was
Right.
designed as a very personal expression, which he's done that a lot of places, and I love it. And he was my hero. But when I
Mhm.
got to this park and I realized this was all Denver has,
Right.
it seemed to be maybe the wrong approach in this
And then,
case.
so for your approach, recognizing all of those things that you just said, then how did you proceed?
Well, that was a lot of politics
Mhm.
and a lot of that was probably that was easily my most difficult commission in my
Okay.
career,
Wow.
because we had the city had created a committee
Mm.
that represented the
Just
stakeholders.
say no more.
Well,
Yeah.
no, but I like to work with committees. I've
Mhm.
kind of learned how to work with committee.
Okay.
I'll even tell you a little story about
Mhm.
how to get the best out of a committee. But in this case, three out of the maybe eight committee members were all preservationists.
Okay.
And so
Right.
any conversation about what will this park look like
Mhm.
was completely shut down.
Interesting. Yeah.
No, we're not going to change a thing. Well, why are we having this committee?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
got to
Yeah.
a point where it was a stalemate, and the deputy mayor and myself and the Parks Commissioner all had to go out to San Francisco and meet with Halpern
Okay.
and sit down with him and go through exactly what it was.
Mhm.
And it was supposed to be a workshop where we could figure out a way to rework it in a way that he'd be happy with it.
Right. And what did it
But
end up being?
when we were all done telling him what it wasn't doing and what we aspired,
Mhm.
or what the city aspired for the park, uh, he basically said, "You can't change a thing." And that was when it kind of there was a kind of a hybrid approach to, we preserved the water features,
Mhm.
but the rest of the park was kind of given over to accommodating certain programs the city had for it. Look, it's a successful park for Denver, but I think
Mhm.
it could have been
It could have
it
been
could have been
more.
an extraordinary park.
Mhm.
But I don't think, and I agree with Halpern, I don't think we could have ever done anything to make it to tweak it a little bit, because his whole design was all about indentations and
Sure.
elevations, and
Sure.
those things weren't working with the program that the city wanted.
Well, let me ask you a question. If there comes a moment in your career where people come back to one of your spaces,
Yeah,
and you know where I'm going with this, right? And they say,
yeah,
"Hey,
it happened already.
okay," they say, "Hey, we love you. Your work is great, but this isn't working,
Yeah,
right? This
baby,
is."
that's
So,
right.
what did you do? Did you say, how did you approach that? And was that process an actual process? Did you first get defensive and then think about it and then come to a conclusion, or were you mature enough to kind of be able to take it as face value? So how did that come to play?
And then, none of those things.
Okay, what did it look like?
Okay, no one came to me.
Okay. Oh, so
You
internally?
see, no one ever came to me and
Oh,
asked me what I thought, right? Or that they were going to do it. It was a total surprise.
got it.
So, it's one of those things where I don't have I don't have that Teflon coating,
Hmm.
the pedigree
Hmm.
that would tell those advocates to, hey, we should talk to the original designer
I
and
see.
get his input on this.
So
It,
like you
it
mean your brand cachet wasn't be able to defend it? Is that what you're saying?
exactly.
Okay. Okay.
No, but it just so happens,
Mm.
this is going to shock you. It's on the same block as my office.
That's pretty, actually,
It,
that's pretty cool.
yeah. Well, it's kind of in your face too, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Yeah.
sure, sure. That's pretty punk rock. That's like, hey,
Yeah.
not only
But
we're
it
not
was
going to reach out to you, but we're just going to do it right here.
who? They're saying, really, who? Who are you?
Yeah, that is
But
funny.
it was a what we call a pops. I guess you know
Sure.
what a pops is,
Hmm.
right? Yeah.
Public,
And
well,
it was,
privately owned public space, right?
yeah, nice
Mhm.
going. Okay, so it was a one I designed maybe 25 years ago,
Okay.
and it won a national honor award.
Okay.
Honor award, not merit, honor
Sure.
award.
Yeah.
It was a very cool park, and it was designed for this emerging population in an area of New York called Nomad.
Okay.
If you know Nomad, it's the new hot neighborhood in Manhattan that's got
Okay.
unbelievable high rises coming up all around it. north of Madison.
Yeah.
That's north of Madison Square Park
Sure.
is what
Sure.
Nomad stands for. But at the time I designed it, it was all these uh, industrial buildings that were the fashion business, just like empty buildings. What do they attract? They attract kind of squatters and website designers and architects and landscape architects and photographers. And all the, the whole neighborhood was a neighborhood in
Bunch
transition.
of beatniks is what I call them.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah. The ones that usually come just before it gets gentrified,
Right,
right?
right, right. Yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
And so uh, at that time, Madison Square Park was just about to be completely renovated from a ripped up old idea of a park into a freshened up idea of the same idea of a park, which is, linear paths, linear benches. I nod my hat to you
Hmm.
as you stroll by, and I say hello with your parasol. It's
Got it.
in a way, Madison Square Park is still that turn of the century kind of a park, but people love it, and it's the center of that neighborhood. But here we were 3 blocks away, and I thought, okay, this is a different this is a different population. I don't even need a meeting with these people because they will never meet me,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not organized.
Right.
But I
And
can tell who
yeah.
they are by the Starbucks that's right next to them that
Hmm.
I see all the day.
Hmm.
I see them on the street. I see them coming in and out of their buildings. I know their story because we were one of them.
Hmm.
We were one of those kind of tenants,
Hmm.
landscape architects with,
Hmm.
frayed collars.
Hmm.
And so my attitude about this was, I'm going to design a plaza for us because we have a different idea how we want to meet with each other and socialize. We
Hmm.
want to collaborate. We want to do cool things. We don't want to just be told to sit in this bench and look in that direction.
Correct.
This entire plaza was designed for, if you will, the creative class that
Yes.
had found its way to that neighborhood. And oh my God, it was so embraced. It was packed with people through the winter. It didn't matter. We got photographs all through the year, just packed with people. But that neighborhood was destined to change.
Sure.
And it changed slowly. It changed to the point where the building that sponsored it had a new condominium association,
Hmm.
and they wanted to be luxury condominiums,
Right.
and they had a price point that was consistent with that, and they had a completely different idea of what they wanted for that public space. They did not want the creative class hanging out there.
Right.
They
Right.
didn't want them hanging out in our swivel chairs and bar stools and benches and all these things that we created. In fact, a line of furniture for landscape forums came out of that project,
Interesting.
where we created a little line of stainless steel furniture. They didn't want that at all. So everything now is nice, and it's rectilinear. It's
Mm.
little pads of planting, little pads of benches. It's really quiet, well behaved, and maybe it's a reflection of the direction that neighborhood's going in.
Mm.
Am I angry about that? No, I think that's it's the forces of the city. Don't try to fight it.
Yeah.
Just accept it. I really look at these pops as almost, we shouldn't look at them as something that should be preserved. We should look at them as something that can easily they should be required to be redesigned every 25 years or
Hmm.
something.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of the reasons this was redesigned was they're all designed over spaces below
Correct.
that requires waterproofing,
Hmm.
that has a shelf life.
It definitely has a shelf life. Yeah.
So that's a built-in way
Right.
to rip them apart and think again, okay, what is the dynamic of the neighborhood now? Who are the stakeholders? Let's
Hmm.
design to that. So I was very much in favor of that. And quite honestly, when they're doing that, I didn't really see a need for them to come to me anyway.
Right.
It was like, you're starting fresh. You don't need me.
Sure. Sure.
So I experienced it a little. It broke my heart a
Yeah.
little bit. I'll
Yeah.
admit it.
I mean, we put so much love and care into the work that
Yeah.
we do that it's okay for us to feel those things. Actually,
Yes.
you would be an anomaly and probably not a good designer if you didn't feel those things.
Exactly. You've got to love it like your own child.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Agreed.
So after you graduated from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, also
Mhm.
known as SUNY, You arrived in New York at the age of 27. Shortly after your arrival to New York, New York birthed two iconic and culturally important music venues, CBGB and Studio 54. Which one of those venues, if any, better reflects who you were at that time? You a CBGB guy or are you a Studio 54 guy?
Okay, look at.
All right, let's
I
hear
have a feeling you know something about me, but you're not revealing it.
it. I don't think that I do. Why? Is there secrets that are gonna fall out of here right now? What's happening?
Well, they're not actually secrets, but a lot of people know there is a, yeah, I need to write a book. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I landed in town and uh, I'm a major rhythm and blues guy. I
Okay.
am not a hippie.
Okay.
I am not a hard rock. I
Yeah.
am not a CBGB.
Right.
I am not punk rock. I don't even know what they called that,
Right.
what that music that was coming out of that doorway.
Okay.
I'm into R&B, dance music, heavy, heavy bass where my chest feels the
Nice.
diaphragm movement
Yes. Yes, sir.
and my feet can move. And I had to find those spaces. I had to go all throughout the boroughs to go to
Hmm.
clubs up in Harlem and Bronx and
Hmm.
Brooklyn and Queens. That was my other life
Okay.
besides landscape architecture. And since when I landed, uh, I couldn't I couldn't get any traction. I really couldn't find work
Hmm.
except for some architects, putting
Sure.
kind of greenscaping their buildings,
Sure.
etc. But I was out there partying late at night, and I thought, maybe I can make something out of this and make a little extra cash. So I started my own after hours discotheque.
No, you did not.
Yes, I did, and it was legendary.
What was it called?
It was called Night Owl. I
Nice.
designed the graphics for it. I did the whole thing, and it didn't open until midnight, and it closed at 7 in the morning.
I love it.
And I would go home and take a shower, and I'd sit in my chair in my office and be a landscape architect.
Wow. Night
You know,
Owl.
I
What
was
what were
both.
the where what borough and what were this
I
what
was
was
right in Manhattan on
okay.
Fourth Avenue between Ninth and 10th Street, and it was probably 90% black
Hmm.
because those were the friends I was making with the
Sure.
partying that I was doing in the outer boroughs. And Stevie Wonder lived. This is crazy, but Stevie Wonder lived 3 blocks away from me. I lived on 16th Street. This place
Oh
was between
wow.
11th and 10th and 11th, and we had two birthday parties and two New Year's Eve parties where he would come and be with us. And if
Amazing.
you know a group called Chic,
Okay.
they got their start at my club. Nile Rodgers has got a whole documentary. He's the hit maker for everybody and Chic, including David Bowie and
Sure.
everybody. He's still a superstar. He got his start at my club because I let him come in with a tape and we played it and everybody loved it. My
No
DJ was a
way.
sound engineer and he
Yeah.
had connections with Atlantic Records, blah blah blah. It
Hmm.
was unbelievable, and it lasted for about 4 or 5 years. But it was an after hours club. That meant it wasn't really legal.
Right. Yeah. Good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So I was smart enough to pull the plug after about 4 years. It
Sure.
was time was up,
Yeah. And
and
that
I was getting busy being a landscape
sure.
architect at
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was an extraordinary chapter in my life, and that's my way of telling you why I would, you know, when we closed down, Studio 54 opened up.
Hmm.
That was just a coincidence, but
Right.
I
Or was
immediately,
it? Or
pardon.
what? Or I said, or was it a coincidence?
Maybe yes, that's right. They got their idea from us, right? But I spent a lot of time in Studio 54, and
Hmm.
and you've read about it, you've heard about it, I'm
Hmm.
sure. It was an extraordinary test tube
Mm.
of the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, definitely,
It was
definitely.
a very interesting time to be in New York, and there were times I wanted out, but I was totally into the streets in the city of New York, and that I did my Holly White research my own way.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
You
And
know,
as so we all should, right?
yeah,
Like,
absolutely. We
you
all
know,
bring something different to the table, and that was mine.
So, okay, by the way, fascinating. And
Yeah.
if when we read your memoir, if there's not a chapter called Night Owl, I will call you up and say, hey,
Okay, all right.
like
All right, you can be the ghostwriter. All right, we're
yeah.
all signed up now. Right?
um, so New York obviously has changed a lot in the last 50 years. But
Yeah.
I'm more curious, what has remained the same?
I'd have to say, I could point to all of the neighborhoods that I would have in Manhattan. When I'm gonna stick to Manhattan right
Mhm,
now because I really know Manhattan
mhm,
better than the outer boroughs. Uh, but I'm going to stick to Manhattan. I could point to the neighborhoods that I would have been uh, spending my time have all been gentrified.
mhm.
What was once, Spanish Harlem
Gentrified.
is different. Is South Harlem now or whatever. We got Nolita north of Little Italy.
Right,
It
right,
used
right.
just to be Little Italy. We go
Yeah,
there for
sure.
a bowl of pasta. Now it's Nolita.
Right, right,
You know,
right.
Tribeca was just industrial buildings. They had when they would have clubs, when they had the old industrial buildings before those neighborhoods were gentrified. That's where the clubs would go
Mm,
because you weren't competing, you weren't creating noise. It wasn't a residential neighborhood. It was just vacant space, and you could create a club. So in those days, all the clubs were in those neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods got gentrified. So that part has changed. But what hasn't changed is the whole dynamism of the city on the streets is still there.
okay.
The grid, the grit,
Hmm.
the sense of discovery in the chance encounters with uh, unlike what we use the expression like-minded people,
Hmm.
unlike-minded people,
Interesting.
chance encounters with unlike-minded people. Why is that so important? It's important to me. I don't want to just be, I'm not tribal. I don't want to
Hmm.
just be around my own.
Hmm.
I want to bump into somebody that I have to, either get to know or learn how to accept and endure with. It's to me, that's part of this. That's what the city brings that the suburbs don't. Is that the
Mm.
city forces us together on a street, on a busy street, or in a subway train, or whatever the encounter might, or in an elevator. We're forced to be with people that we wouldn't necessarily choose to be with, but interesting things come out of those encounters. Just a
Hearing
sense of tolerance, and maybe even a connection, a social connection.
hearing you say that kind of reminds me of Andy Warhol's philosophy that the richest of the person and the poorest of the person are both drinking the same Coca-Cola and
That's right.
and enjoying it the same.
Exactly. And they're walking down the same street, riding
Hmm.
the same train, sitting on the same park bench. That's the beauty of the city.
That's
It's
your answer. That's what's remained the same
yeah, that's
is
what's
that.
all it will always be that way as long
Mhm.
as humans are on this earth.
I love it. Okay. This one's a really interesting question for me to ask. And that is, you are one of three brothers that all practice landscape architecture. It's a
Yeah.
rarity to have any additional member of the family be a landscape architect, let alone three brothers.
Hmm.
Describe to me what a conversation about landscape architecture with your brothers might look like.
Well, that's a sensitive question
Okay.
because there aren't many.
Mm,
Uh, there aren't many at all. It used to be. I don't want to dive too deep in this because it is
that's
very
okay.
sensitive.
Yeah,
It
that's
was a
okay.
very sensitive subject in our family gatherings
Hmm.
because I I managed to navigate my career to levels that they didn't quite reach,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it was best that I didn't talk about what I was doing.
I understand. We can move on.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
but yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. All right. All right. Why do you think the landscape architect Paul Friedberg was disliked? And what about him or his work is appealing to you?
Well, Who told you he was disliked?
Maybe
Is that the word on the street?
well, maybe I'm just making things up.
No, I don't. I'm
Well,
wondering how you get that. How
how
did you get
about
that intel? Because I think it's true as a whole
mhm.
within the profession. He was disliked is a kind of a strong word, but I'll let it be.
Maybe
He was.
challenged?
No, not challenged. He
Mhm.
was. He was. People are always envious and jealous, but he had. So Paul was a New Yorker.
Mhm.
It's tough being a New Yorker in a field of gentlemen landscape architects.
Got it.
You know, gentlemen farmers, gentlemen landscape architects, gentlemen architects. Our profession still carries a lot of that.
Mhm.
It attracts, you know, if I take a poll, no matter where I lecture, and I always ask the question of the students, all right, when did you first hear about landscape architecture? When
Mhm.
did you first understand that it was even a thing?
Okay.
And when did you finally decide this is what you wanted to do? And they'll all tell me you know these stories. They're crazy. Oh, my roommate's best friend's
Mm.
brother
Right.
was doing something, and I discovered this. You know, it's the insanity of
Mhm.
the way people find. Maybe not so much today, but certainly in the past.
Right.
But almost always they were attracted to the first word and not the second word.
Mhm.
You know, if you were at a cocktail party and you said you were a landscape architect, you know, they would say, "Can you help me with my lawn?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would
Yeah.
say, look out the window. Do you see a
Right.
mower on a truck out?
Sure, sure.
It's we create our own misconception of the profession
Mhm.
because the word landscape attracts a certain kind of person, that
Mhm.
gentleman landscape architect
Got it.
that is attracted to the landscape part of it, and not so much to urbanism and the dirty, nasty
Mhm.
messiness of cities. That's not why people come into landscape architecture as a rule.
Mm.
But Paul was a New Yorker, and
Right.
that was what he was about. That's what he focused on, and he wanted to address the critical issues of the cities in the 60s and 70s. And he was very brusque in his personality and very direct the way he presented things. But he was
Which was
he was
acceptable
brilliant.
but it was acceptable in his circles, right? There was nothing to be offended by in his circles, and um he didn't. I'm assuming then, hearing from what you're saying, is that he didn't cater then to changing in order to appease, and he's just like, this is who I am
No,
and this is where I'm going.
but he wasn't part of that big Harvard Penn
Right.
gentleman landscape architects circle
Mm-hmm.
family. And so if you hear that he was disliked, it would be coming maybe from that source. I'm not blaming it on Harvard or Penn, but
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a representation of the middle America, or maybe, I don't know. Paul's circle was very small.
Mm-hmm.
His
Mm-hmm.
work just spoke for itself, and it came in and knocked the door down, and you're going to let me in,
Mm-hmm.
kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he
All right.
was, yeah, he was, and quite honestly, I think if people describe me in your podcast 20 or 25 years from now, they might be saying the exact same thing about me, because I was inspired by his independence and his outspokenness. And it was sort of, I adopted this thing when I was in the city. Like, we're going to have to just kick doors down
Right.
to make things happen, to make this city better. We can't do it with a gentle hand.
Right.
And that's the way Paul went about it. And to a certain extent, that's the way I've gone about it.
So is that what you find appealing about him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. When I came to the city and started my practice, he was the only nationally on the national scene, the only New York landscape architect on the national scene. There was not another.
Mm.
He was it. And when I came, I started making waves and getting noticed. So he and I ended up at the opposite ends,
Sure.
competing with each other. Uh, but New York was really void of national landscape architects until about 30 years ago.
Got it.
We didn't have that. We didn't have a university was kicking out people with master's degrees. We just had City College.
Right.
So it's a different model.
All right, let's change courses here. What value do rooftop amenities provide to developers, and what value do rooftop amenities provide to the tenants?
Well, I guess knowing developers the way I do, I'd say they add value to their investment.
So like a direct ROI.
Yeah. If they're seen as a added benefit to a tenant or a purchaser of a condo or a tenant of the building, whether it could be an office, it could be a corporation, it could be a residential building. If it's an added benefit, an amenity, then it's adding value to that. And they're going to, let's say it's an office building and they build a roof terrace that all the tenants have access to. Well, you can charge a couple dollars more a square foot for that additional amenity. That adds up to an extraordinary amount of money, but yet the developers are still slow to jump on this idea of developing those rooftops. When I first came to the city, maybe the first 5 or 6 years, I was occasionally running into clients that had those top floor conference rooms where you look out the window while you're waiting for them to walk in. And I would look down on the city and all I saw was habitat roofs. I mean, how could anyone say that we have an open space shortage in New York when we have all these rooftops that are waiting to be dog runs and habitat roofs and you name it, workspace.
So wait, are you saying almost like as if those spaces are like the desire lines, but of like spaces on top, right? Like like people are using them informally, and so why not formalize it?
Of course, and it's being done already.
Sure,
on a very small scale, but they are without a doubt, and the developers are capitalizing on it with the additional rent because they're pointing to it. It's in their brochures. Oh, you have this terrace you can go to for workspaces or whatever. It's a very big thing. In fact, in San Francisco, you may not know it, but in New York, we have POPs, privately owned public spaces. And that's all coming out of incentive zoning, where the developer creates it, right?
Sure.
Builds it, maintains it, but it's got to be on the ground at the same level as the street.
Correct.
San Francisco made an exception to that. And they're putting a sign outside a building and then letting the developer build the POPs up on a roof terrace.
And is there access to
they're getting zoning bonuses for it.
Is there access to the people?
In an elevator, sign, go in here, go all the way up to the 30th floor. There's a terrace here, but the fact is that building didn't even have to pull back from the street.
Right.
They're getting their bonuses, additional FAR, by just developing the roof terraces.
Interesting.
So, I think San Francisco points to those particular POPs, but they're called popos or something like that. As it's questionable how really successful they are, because they depend on signage and people walk by the building, they don't know that the roof terrace is there.
Right. There might also be a barrier, just like a social barrier of feeling that space is accessible. Yeah.
In New York, it's interesting. In New York, the POPs could be, they were very lax about where they could be. But in the last 20 years, 25 years, this is contrary to what you were just suggesting. They're insisting that the POPs, that the entrance to the building lead out onto the POPs.
Got it.
And not down directly to the street. And the reason for that is they were treating the POPs like I don't care what happens there. We come and go from the street.
But if the tenants that are paying high rent have to, that is their egress, then by default they have to be designed well.
And it's going to keep it active 24 hours a day.
And maintained.
and
All
maintain.
of that
Exactly.
at a higher
So
level
it's
than okay. Interesting.
but it's interesting. The first thought is, oh,
Yeah.
no, this. But when you start to rip this
Hmm.
apart
Hmm.
and study it, there's other forces. It's like they used to do with waterfront parks. Oh my God, you don't want a street between the buildings and the waterfront park. Yes, you do, because
Hmm.
that building begins to treat that park like it's its front yard if you don't
Right.
have that public realm ribbon. So
Yeah.
it's never straightforward.
It's never straightforward. Design is
I
never
love.
linear. Oh
Yeah, never
man.
linear. Yeah,
Never. Never, never, never.
never.
Okay. There is a pull quote. So you have a book called self-titled Thomas Balsley, Uncommon Ground.
Hmm.
And there's a pull quote by Peter Walker. And I'm going to read that pull quote and then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question to it. And he says, Balsley's practice is real, highly political, and artful. And he has made himself a spokesperson for open space, the designed public realm, and landscape architecture. End quote. So here's my question. If you had to extract any one of those accolades to represent your legacy, which one would it be? And maybe he missed. Maybe there's one there that
Oh yeah, I could write my own, but I that was a tough one.
Mhm.
I'm going to a spokesperson for open space in the design public realm. God, who wouldn't want to be that?
Okay.
But you could be a spokesperson for them as a thinker or a writer.
Okay.